The wind has teeth tonight. It bites through wool and canvas, a predator of ice and air that hunts the plains without mercy. It screams a high, thin keen that shreds the nerves of men and beasts alike. Here, on the northern stretch of the Montana Territory, the world has been bleached of all color, reduced to a maelstrom of white on white. Snow doesn't fall. It attacks horizontally, a billion tiny daggers seeking any sliver of exposed skin. For Elias Thorne, trail boss of the Circle T Drive, the world has shrunk to the 10 feet of churning chaos in front of his horse. Beyond that lies nothing but the howling void where his 2,000 head of longhorn cattle are supposed to be. He can't see them, but he can feel them, a low, rumbling tremor of panic that travels from the frozen earth up through the bones of his exhausted mount. They are on the verge of scattering, a suicidal impulse to outrun the storm that will lead them to exhaustion and death in scattered, frozen monuments to his failure. This herd is everything. It is the culmination of a lifetime of labor, the single pot he has wagered against a mountain of debt that threatens to swallow his family's ranch whole. Losing this herd isn't just a financial loss, it is erasure. His men, seasoned drovers with leathered skin and eyes accustomed to the vast emptiness of the frontier, are failing. He can hear their shouted curses, snatched away and mangled by the wind. They are shadows on horseback, circling uselessly, their presence only adding to the cattle's terror. The lead steers are turning, their massive horns hooking at the air, their primordial fear overriding years of trail discipline. This is how it ends. A white death, ruin carried on the wind. But then, through the blizzard's shriek, another sound emerges. It is low and steady, a human voice, but not a shout. It's a song, a chant almost, a strange, resonant hum that seems to vibrate on a frequency beneath the storm's rage. Elias squints, his eyes raw and weeping from the cold. He sees a figure, not on a horse but on foot, a small, dark shape moving with impossible calm at the very head of the terrified herd. It's the woman, the cook's assistant, Sarah. She is walking into the teeth of the blizzard, a singular point of stillness in a world of violent motion. One hand is pressed against the swell of her belly, a stark reminder of the impossible burden she already carries. With the other, she holds a short length of rope tied to the halter of the lead steer, a massive, wild-eyed beast they call Behemoth. The steer should have trampled her, gored her, thrown her aside in its panic. Instead, its head is lowered, its steps shortening to match her own plodding pace. Her voice, that strange, calming melody, is meant only for him, and the great animal is listening. Behind Behemoth, the next steer follows, and the next, a chain reaction of de-escalating panic. She is turning the tide, not with force, but with a whisper. She is leading them through the heart of the maelstrom, a pregnant woman walking to save them all. Elias watches her, a ghost in the swirling white, and knows his entire future rests on the shoulders of the one person he never should have hired. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The bargain had been struck in dust, not snow. 2 months earlier, under a relentless sun that baked the very air, Elias Thorne had been making his final count. The town of Prairie Dog Creek was little more than a collection of clabbered aspirations clinging to the edge of a rail line, the last stop for supplies before the long push north. His crew was assembled, a dozen hard men, some reliable, some less so, but all he could afford. He'd first seen her as a smudge of weary determination standing near the general store, a cheap carpetbag at her feet. She wasn't from here. Her clothes, though worn, lacked the specific dust-caked resignation of the local women. There was a stillness about her, a way of watching the world as if she were braced for a blow. When she approached him, her gaze was direct, betraying none of the demure pleading he might have expected. "You're the trail boss for the Circle T?" Her voice was quiet, but clear. Elias had been tallying sacks of flour with his cook, a grizzled old man named Silas, whose temperament was as sour as a sourdough starter. He grunted an affirmative, not bothering to look up from his ledger. Time was money, and he was short on both. "I need work," she said. That made him pause. He looked up properly then. She was young, maybe 20. Her face was fine-boned, framed by dark hair pulled back severely, but it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths he saw an exhaustion so profound it looked like a physical weight. Still, there was no weakness there. There was grit, but grit didn't make a woman fit for a cattle drive. "This ain't no place for a woman," he'd said, his voice flat. It was the simple, unassailable truth. It was a world of sweat, dirt, danger, and relentless, crude masculinity. "I can cook. I can mend. I can wash. I'm a hard worker." Each statement was a plain, unadorned fact. "Gotta cook," he said, jerking his chin toward Silas, who scowled at her as if she were a weevil in his flour. "He could use a hand," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "A crew this size? He'll be run ragged by the second week." She was right, of course. Silas was getting old, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But the cost of another wage, another mouth to feed. "Can't afford it," he said, turning back to his ledger. It was the end of the conversation. But Silas, surprisingly, spoke up. "Hold on, boss." The old cook hobbled closer, squinting at the woman. He looked at her hands. They were chapped and calloused, but clean. He looked at her posture. Straight, despite the weariness that clung to her like a second skin. "What's your name, girl?" "Sarah. You know how to make coffee that don't taste like mud? And biscuits that won't break a tooth." A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a softening, touched her lips. "Edo." Silas turned to Elias. "I'm getting old, Eli. My back ain't what it was. An extra pair of hands for half wages means better food for the men. Better food means less grumbling." He lowered his voice. "Look at her. She ain't got nowhere else to go. She's running from something. We leave her here. What do you think happens to her?" Elias knew what happened. Prairie Dog Creek was a hard town for a man and a death sentence for a lone woman with no money and no protector. He looked at Sarah again. He saw the faint, desperate plea behind the stony mask of her pride. He thought of his own sisters, safe back on the ranch he was trying to save. He thought of the pittance of half wages. It was a risk. A woman on the trail could be a distraction, a source of conflict. The men would talk. Some would be resentful. Others might get ideas. He prided himself on running a clean, orderly drive. "You cause one bit of trouble," he said, his voice a low warning. "One bit, and I'll leave you at the next settlement we pass, no matter how small. You answer to Silas. You keep to the chuck wagon, and you stay clear of the men. Understand?" "I understand," she said, and the relief that washed over her face was so immense it was almost painful to watch. She had been standing on a cliff's edge, and he had pulled her back. He didn't know then about the secret she carried, hidden beneath the loose drape of her dress. He didn't know she wasn't just running from something, but fighting for someone. He'd made a decision based on a flicker of pity and the pragmatic advice of his cook. He couldn't have known that in doing so, he had just hired the one person who would stand between him and utter ruin. The first weeks on the trail settled into a rhythm of monotonous hardship. Dust, heat, and the constant, soul-shaking bellow of cattle. Elias was a man consumed by the mathematics of survival. He rode the line from sunup to sundown, his mind a constant ledger of miles covered, water sources ahead, the health of his herd, the morale of his men. He was a good boss, fair, demanding, and distant. He kept himself apart, a solitary figure of authority. He was aware of Sarah in the way a man is aware of a new gear in a familiar machine. He noticed the improvement in the food. The coffee was stronger, the biscuits lighter. Silas's grumbling decreased by a measurable degree. He saw her from a distance, a small figure perpetually shrouded in the dust and smoke of the chuck wagon, her movements efficient and tireless. She kept to her word, a model of quiet industry. She never spoke to the men beyond what was necessary, her eyes always downcast, her presence unobtrusive. The men, for their part, mostly left her alone. They were too tired, too focused on the work. There were muttered comments at first, of course. Jebediah Stone, a veteran drover with a streak of meanness as wide as the plains, had been the most vocal. Bad luck, bringing a woman on a drive. He'd spat into the fire one night, loud enough for Elias to overhear. Temptation and trouble, that's all they are. Elias had let his gaze rest on Jeb for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became uncomfortable. He didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. She was under his protection, an employee of the Circle T, and that was the end of it. Jeb had subsided into a sullen silence, but his resentment simmered, a poison in the camp's atmosphere. Elias saw the scornful looks Jeb and a few others sent toward the chuck wagon, the way they seemed to take pleasure in making her work harder, demanding extra coffee, or complaining about the food just to exert their petty power. Sarah never reacted, her face a mask of placid indifference. It was Silas who told him. They were a month in, crossing a flat, featureless expanse where the horizon shimmered with heat. Elias had ridden back to the wagon for a canteen of fresh water. Silas was kneading dough, his movements slow and pained. Sarah was scrubbing a large pot, her back to them. "She's with child, you know," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Elias froze, the canteen halfway to his lips. He looked at Sarah's back, at the worn fabric of her dress. He hadn't noticed. He'd been so consumed by the herd, by the numbers, he'd failed to see the most obvious human truth right in front of him. He felt a hot spike of anger, at her for the deception, and at himself for his blindness. This changed everything. A cattle drive was dangerous enough. For a pregnant woman, it was suicide. "How far along?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "My wife had 6, Silas said, not looking up from his dough. "I'd say 5 months, maybe a bit more. She hides it well. She lied to me. She was desperate, Eli. You think you'd have hired her if you knew? You think anyone would have?" Silas wiped his floured hands on his apron. "She's a good worker. The best I've had. Never complains. Does the work of 2. What she's got growing inside her is her business. Surviving is ours." Elias looked at Sarah again. He saw the slight thickness at her waist that he'd dismissed as a trick of her loose clothing. He saw the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes that he'd attributed to the trail. A lone woman, pregnant, desperate enough to lie her way onto a cattle drive. The story behind that was surely one of tragedy and shame. He felt a confusing mix of fury, pity, and a strange, unwelcome surge of respect. He should have been angry at the liability she represented. Instead, he found himself furious at the world that had put her in this position. He walked over to where she was scrubbing. She tensed as a shadow fell over her, but didn't look up. "Silas tells me you're expecting," he said, his tone clipped. She stopped scrubbing. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction. It was the only sign of defeat he'd ever seen from her. She finally turned, her chin raised in a familiar gesture of defiance, but her eyes were filled with a desperate, hunted look. "I can still work," she said. "It doesn't stop me. I pull my weight." "That's not the point," he snapped, his anger getting the better of him. "This is no place for you. It's dangerous." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I needed to eat," she retorted, a flash of fire in her stormy eyes. "I was thinking my baby needed me to eat. I wasn't thinking about your convenience, Mr. Thorne. I was thinking about survival. Is there any more to it than that?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. The raw, unvarnished truth of them silenced his arguments. He was thinking of risk management. She was thinking of life and death. He saw his own desperation mirrored in her, the same single-minded focus on making it to the end of the line. He stood there for a long moment, the sun beating down on his neck. He was the boss. He could send her back. He could leave her at the next fort. It would be the sensible thing to do. But looking at her, standing there with her fierce pride and her terrible vulnerability, he knew he couldn't. It wouldn't be justice. "See that you get more rest," he said gruffly, turning away before she could see the conflict in his face. "Silas can handle the mornings." It was not forgiveness. It was not kindness. It was a concession, a small shift in the gears of the machine. But for Sarah, it was everything. It was a reprieve. And for Elias, It was the first time he truly saw her not as a hand or a problem, but as a person whose fate had become inexplicably tangled with his own. The fragile sanctuary they had built on the trail was about to be tested, not by the judgment of men, but by the fury of nature itself. The sky to the northwest was beginning to take on a bruised, purple hue. The cold came first. It arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, predatory chill that seeped into the bones. The sun vanished behind a high, milky film of cloud, and the air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, oppressive silence. The cattle sensed it before the men did. They grew restless, their lowing taking on a new, anxious pitch. Elias had been riding point, scanning the horizon. He'd seen the signs, but he had hoped to outrun it, to push the herd into the relative shelter of the broken country that lay a day's ride ahead. Nature, however, was not accommodating. The first snowflakes drifted down, large and wet, melting on the backs of steers. Then the wind began to whisper, a low moan that grew steadily into a ferocious howl. Within an hour, the world dissolved. The blizzard struck with a violence that defied belief. Visibility dropped to zero. The snow was no longer soft flakes, but a blinding, stinging torrent of ice particles driven by a gale that threatened to tear a man from his saddle. Elias yelled orders, but his words were ripped from his mouth and lost. He could barely see his own horse's ears. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. This was a wideout, the plainsman's ultimate nightmare. The herd, already on edge, broke. The cohesive, moving river of beef and horn fractured into 1,000 panic streams. The men were swallowed by the storm, their frantic shouts becoming faint cries of despair. He saw one rider, a young hand named Billy, get unhorsed as his mount shied from a bolting steer. The boy disappeared into the white fury before Elias could even react. This was it, the complete loss of control, the end of the Circle T. He fought his horse toward the head of the stampede, a futile gesture. He was just one man against 2,000 terrified animals and a godless storm. The cattle were turning back, running with the wind, the worst possible scenario. They would run until they dropped, scattered over miles of unforgiving terrain. It was in that moment of absolute despair that he heard it. The sound was so unexpected, so alien to the chaos, that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It was Sarah's voice, a low, steady melodic chant. It cut through the wind's scream, not with volume, but with a peculiar resonance that seemed to calm the very air. He spurred his horse forward, squinting through the blinding snow. And then he saw her. She was on the ground, having left the relative safety of the chuck wagon. The wagon itself was a lost cause. Silas likely hunkered down inside, praying. But Sarah had walked out into the heart of the storm. She was standing directly in the path of the lead steers. In one hand, she clutched the rope to Behemoth's halter. The great steer, whose panicked charge had initiated the stampede, was now standing still, its massive head lowered, its wild eyes fixed on her. Her other hand rested on her swollen belly, a gesture of instinctual protection. She wasn't trying to stop them. She was trying to hold them. Her song, a wordless, ancient-sounding lullaby, was a thread of sanity in a world gone mad. The animals closest to her were beginning to mill, their momentum blunted by her impossible calm. They were listening. Elias felt a jolt, a surge of something beyond reason. His veteran cowhands had failed. His own experience was useless. All logic dictated that this woman should be the first victim of the storm. Instead, she was their only hope. He made a decision born of pure desperation, a complete abdication of everything he knew about leading a cattle drive. He found Jeb first, a frantic shadow fighting to turn a small group of steers. "Jeb," Elias roared, his voice raw. "Fall back. Get the men and fall in behind the chuck wagon. Let her lead." Jeb turned, his face a mask of incredulous fury, caked in snow. "What? Are you insane, boss? That woman will get us all killed. We have to turn them. We can't turn them." Elias yelled back, the truth of it a bitter pill. "They'll scatter to hell and back. She's holding them. Now do as I say." "That's an order." For a moment, Jeb stared, his expression a mixture of mutiny and disbelief. Then, seeing the absolute, unyielding command in Elias's eyes, he gave a curt, angry nod and wheeled his horse away, his curses lost to the gale. Elias didn't wait to see if he obeyed. He rode toward Sarah, placing himself and his horse between her and the worst of the wind, a silent, grim-faced guardian. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were closed, her focus absolute, her voice the only anchor in the swirling white abyss. The herd, responding to some deep, instinctual memory, began to fall in behind their strangely serene leader, a slow-moving island of life in an ocean of snow. The stampede was over. The long walk had just begun. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare, a slow-motion descent into a frozen hell. Time ceased to have meaning, measured only in the deepening cold and the mounting exhaustion that felt like sand grinding in his bones. The world remained a churning vortex of white. The only constants were the shriek of the wind and the low, unwavering hum of Sarah's voice. Elias stayed with her, riding a tight circle around the head of the column. He became her shield. He'd position his horse to take the brunt of the wind, creating a small pocket of relative calm for her. He watched her every step, his heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with his cattle. He saw the way she plodded forward, one foot in front of the other, her steps sure and steady even as the snow deepened around her ankles. She never faltered, never looked back. Her entire being was focused on the great steer at her side and the song that held the herd together. The other men had fallen in behind, a grim, silent procession of mounted ghosts. Their initial disbelief had given way to a stunned, grudging acceptance. They could see it was working. The herd was moving, slowly, painfully, but they were together. They were alive. They owed it to the pregnant cook's assistant. The irony was so bitter it could freeze the spit in a man's mouth. Twice, Elias dismounted, forcing his own stiff limbs to move. He'd press his canteen of water, kept from freezing by the heat of his own body, to her lips. She would drink, her eyes never opening, her song never ceasing. He broke off a piece of hard jerky and pushed it into her hand. He didn't know if she ate it, but he had to try. He was acting on an instinct deeper than that of a boss protecting an asset. He was witnessing a miracle of endurance, and he felt a desperate, primal need to sustain it. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask, rimmed with frost from her own breath. He saw a small trickle of blood from her chapped lips, where the cold had split the skin. Still she walked. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, the hand pressed against her belly, and ached with a terrifying sense of helplessness. He could shield her from the wind, but he couldn't take the cold from her bones or the strain from her body. He could only bear witness. During a brief lull, when the wind dropped from a scream to a roar, he rode close enough for her to hear him. "Sarah, can you go on?" Her eyes opened then, and they were frighteningly clear. They were the eyes of someone who had gone somewhere deep inside herself, to a place of pure will. "The herd is calm," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "If we stop, they'll get spooked again. We have to keep moving until it breaks." He wanted to argue. He wanted to drag her to the wagon, wrap her in every blanket they owned, and force hot broth down her throat. But he saw the truth in her words. She understood the animals in a way he never had. This wasn't just a job for her. It was an art, a communion. The song, he managed to ask, needing to understand. "What is it?" "My father," she said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "We raised Highland stock. They were half wild. He taught me the old calls. They don't hear the words. They hear the peace in it. It tells them they're safe." And there it was. Her secret. Not the shame he had imagined, but a legacy. She came from cattle people, from a line of knowledge that his own brute force experience couldn't match. She wasn't just a desperate woman. She was a master of her craft, a craft he hadn't even known existed. The respect he felt for her solidified into something hard and durable, like river stone. The blizzard raged for what felt like an eternity. A day, a night, another day. Men nodded off in their saddles, waking with a jolt of terror. Horses trembled on the verge of collapse. But Sarah walked on. Her song became the heartbeat of the drive, the rhythm of their survival. When the storm finally broke, it was with an exhausted sigh. The wind dropped, the snow thinned, and a weak, watery sun revealed a world transformed. They were in a valley, a shallow basin that had offered some meager protection. The landscape was a uniform blanket of pristine, dazzling white. And behind them, stretching back as far as the eye could see, was the herd. They were all there, battered, gaunt but alive. Every single one of them. Sarah finally stopped. Her song faded into the sudden, profound silence. The rope to Behemoth slipped from her fingers. She stood for a moment, swaying, a lone figure in the vast, white emptiness. Then her knees buckled. Elias was off his horse before she hit the ground. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her small, surprisingly solid frame. She was lighter than he'd imagined, yet she felt more substantial than anyone he had ever known. She sagged against him, her head falling against his chest, all the iron that had held her up for 2 days finally dissolving. She was unconscious. He lifted her into his arms. The men watched, their faces grim and unreadable in the pale light. Jebediah Stone sat on his horse, his mouth a thin, hard line, his usual sneer absent. He simply watched as Elias carried Sarah toward the chuck wagon, his steps crunching in the deep snow. Silas had the door open, his face a mess of worry and relief. "Is she? She's exhausted," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "Get every blanket we have, and make a broth, the strongest you can." He laid her down gently on a makeshift bed inside the wagon, a small, protected space that smelled of flour and bacon grease. He worked with a tenderness that would have shocked his men, pulling off her frozen gloves to chafe her icy hands, tucking the warm wool blankets tight around her. He lingered for a moment, his hand resting on her forehead, pushing back a stray, damp strand of hair. Her skin was as cold as marble. He felt a surge of fear so potent it stole his breath. He had gotten his herd through, but he was terrified he was about to lose their savior. For 2 days, Sarah lay in the chuck wagon, drifting in and out of a deep, exhausted sleep. The camp was subdued, the usual rough banter replaced by a quiet solemnity. Elias had posted a guard to ensure absolute silence around the wagon. The men, even Jeb, complied without complaint. They were processing what they had witnessed. They shoveled paths through the snow, tended to the weary cattle, and spoke in low tones, their eyes often drifting toward the wagon that had become a strange sort of shrine. Elias found he couldn't stay away. He made excuses to check on the supplies, to confer with Silas, but both he and the cook knew the real reason. He would stand by her cot, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest, a sight that brought him a ridiculous amount of relief. Silas, a surprisingly gentle nurse, would spoon broth between her lips whenever she stirred. During one of his vigils, as the afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, she woke. Her eyes fluttered open, clear and lucid. She looked at him, not with fear or confusion, but with a quiet, assessing gaze. "The herd," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Safe," he said, his own voice softer than he intended. "All of them, thanks to you." She closed her eyes for a moment, a flicker of relief crossing her features. "My father would be proud." He would, Elias agreed. He pulled up a crate and sat down, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable just a week prior. "You should have told me, Sarah, about your family, about what you could do." She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. "Would you have believed me? A 20-year-old girl telling a veteran trail boss she knows a better way to handle his herd." She gave a small, wry smile. "Men like you don't listen to girls like me. You listen to what you can see. So I waited until you could see." Her perception was so sharp, so accurate, it disarmed him. She was right. He wouldn't have listened. He was a man who trusted his own experience above all else. He had been proud, and his pride had nearly cost him everything. This young, pregnant woman had been forced to wait for a life-threatening disaster just to be heard. The injustice of it settled heavily in his chest. "My family lost our ranch," she said, her voice growing stronger. The bank took it after my father passed. Bad winter, lost too many head. I was supposed to marry a man in the next valley. A good man, but old. An arrangement. After the ranch was gone, his family decided I wasn't a suitable match anymore. No dowry, you see, she said it without a trace of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. And the baby, she trailed off, her hand moving to rest protectively on her stomach. The father was a ranch hand who promised marriage and then disappeared when he heard the bank was foreclosing. I learned a lot about the value of a man's promise that winter. Elias listened, his own problems, his debts, his fears of failure, suddenly seeming small and manageable compared to the mountain of loss and betrayal she had climbed. He had been fighting for a future. She had been fighting for the next breath. "So you came here," he said. "I heard they were hiring for the big drives out of Prairie Dog Creek," she confirmed. "It was the only thing I knew. Cattle. I figured if I could just get a job, any job, I could save enough to find a small place, a room somewhere before the baby came. A place to be safe. A place to be safe." The words echoed in the small, quiet space of the wagon. That was all she wanted. He looked around the cramped, rough-hewn interior. This was the safest place she had found. It was a humbling, damning thought. He had a home. A ranch that was struggling, yes, but it was a solid house with a stone fireplace and fields that belonged to him. It was a place of safety and legacy that he had always taken for granted. As they pushed on, the dynamic of the drive had irrevocably shifted. The men's scorn for Sarah had transformed into a kind of mythic awe. They no longer saw her as a burden, but as a talisman. They made sure she always had the driest firewood, the first cup of coffee. Jeb Stone, in a stunning act of penance, was caught one evening clumsily trying to mend a tear in the chuck wagon's canvas cover, a task far below his station. He growled at anyone who looked at him, but he didn't stop. Elias felt the shift most profoundly within himself. His concern was no longer just for her well-being, it was for her future. They were 2 weeks from the railhead at Miles City. The drive would be over. The men would be paid, and they would scatter. His debt would be settled, his ranch saved. But Sarah would be alone again. A single mother with a newborn in a rough cattle town, with only a few dollars of half wages to her name. The thought had become a constant, nagging burr in his mind. He found himself watching her. He watched the quiet efficiency of her work, her gentle interactions with Silas, the way she would sometimes stand at the edge of the firelight, her hand on her belly, staring out into the vast, dark plains as if searching for something she knew she would never find. He saw not weakness or desperation, but a profound and lonely strength. He was a man who valued competence and grit above all else, and she possessed more of both than any man on his crew. The idea of her being cast adrift was more than just an injustice. It felt like a terrible waste. One evening, Elias overheard 2 of the younger hands talking by the fire. "Wonder what'll happen to her once we hit town," one said. "Same thing that happens to most lone women in a place like that." The other replied with a shrug, his tone callously pragmatic. "She'll find a man, or she'll end up working in one of the saloons. Not many other choices for a woman with a babe and no ring on her finger." The casual cruelty of their assessment lit a fuse in Elias's gut. He turned and walked away from the fire, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. They weren't wrong. That was the cold, hard reality of a world. But it didn't have to be her reality. He had a choice. He was the boss. He was the man whose entire future she had single-handedly saved from a frozen grave. The debt he owed her couldn't be paid in wages. It was a debt of life, a debt of honor. He knew what he had to do. It was a crazy, radical idea, one that flew in the face of all convention. It was a business decision that was tangled up in something far more personal. He walked through the sleeping camp, the snow crunching under his boots, his mind set. He stopped before the chuck wagon, took a deep breath, and knocked softly on the frame. Sarah opened the door, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The lantern light from within cast a soft glow on her face. "Mr. Thorne, can I speak with you, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, stepping aside to let him into the cramped space. Silas was already asleep in his bedroll, his snores a soft counterpoint to the crackling of the small stove. Sarah sat on her cot, watching him with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. Elias didn't know how to begin. The words felt clumsy and inadequate. He was a man of action, not speeches. So he spoke the way he knew best, plainly and directly. "In a week, we'll be in Miles City," he began, his gaze fixed on the stove. "I'll sell the herd. With any luck, the price will be good. I'll clear my debt, and I'll have enough left over to restock the ranch and see it through the next year." She listened, her expression unreadable. "You saved that herd, Sarah," he continued, finally meeting her eyes. "Not me, not my men. You. What I paid you, what I agreed to pay you, it's an insult. It's nothing compared to what you did. It was the wage we agreed upon," she said quietly. "You've been fair to me, Mr. Thorne." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't. I misjudged you from the first day. I saw a problem, not a person." He took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. "This was the hard part. I have a ranch. It's not large. 1,000 acres in the Wind River Valley. It's good land with a solid house. But it's been neglected. It needs work. It needs someone who knows cattle, who knows the land. It needs more than one person to make it thrive." He paused, gathering his courage. "I can't pay you what you're worth in cash. I won't have that much. But I have land. I have a future. And you saved it. So I'm making you a proposition. Not a wage. A partnership. Half the ranch. The deed, the stock, the brand. Half of it is yours. We run it together." The silence in the wagon was absolute, broken only by Silas's snoring. Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked utterly stunned, her composure completely shattered. You're offering me half of your home?" she stammered. "I'm offering you half of your ranch," he corrected her gently. "You earned it. No more so. It's a place to be safe, Sarah. For you, and for the baby. A real home. No one can take it from you." She searched his face, her eyes wide with a storm of conflicting emotions. He could see the hope warring with a lifetime of earned suspicion. "Why?" she whispered. Is this pity?" The question was a knife, and it cut deep. He had to give her the honest answer. "The pity is what made me hire you, Sarah. And I'm ashamed of that. This is not pity. This is respect. The deepest respect I've ever had for another person. I'm not a charitable man. I'm a practical one. And practically speaking, I'd be a fool to let the best cattle hand I've ever seen walk away." He saw tears welling in her eyes, and she looked away, fiercely trying to blink them back. She, who had faced down a blizzard without flinching, was undone by a simple, honest proposition. "You would do that?" she asked, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "You would tie your name and your property to a disgraced woman and her fatherless child?" "The only disgrace I see," Elias said, his voice firm and unwavering, "would be in letting you leave. The decision is yours. But the offer is real. Partner." He said the last word deliberately, letting it hang in the air between them. It was a word of equality, of shared burden and shared reward. He had laid his cards on the table. Now, he could only wait for her to decide whether to trust the hand he had dealt her. She looked from his earnest face to her own hands, resting on the swell of her belly, and in the warm, flickering light of the lantern, he saw the first, fragile seeds of a new future begin to take root in the barren ground of her hope. The arrival in Miles City was a jolt to the senses. After months on the vast, quiet plains, the town was a cacophony of noise and humanity. The air, thick with the smell of mud, coal smoke, and cheap whiskey, felt suffocating. Cattle pens stretched for acres, filled with the lowing of 1,000 herds, the final stop on their long journey to the rail cars that would carry them east. Elias moved with a grim efficiency, negotiating with the cattle buyers, his mind a whirl of numbers and contracts. Sarah remained with Silas at the edge of town, where they had made their final camp. She had accepted his offer with a quiet, tearful nod, and a new, fragile understanding existed between them. It was not yet friendship, and certainly not romance, but a partnership forged in ice and sealed with mutual respect. They were a unit now, their futures entwined. The deal was struck. The price for the cattle was better than Elias had dared to hope. The blizzard that had nearly destroyed him had also delayed his rivals, driving up demand. He stood with the buyer, a portly man in a clean suit, and signed the final papers. A bank draft was pressed into his hand, a slip of paper that represented solvency, survival, and the beginning of something new. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of debt lifted from his shoulders. He paid the men first, a bonus for every one of them. They took the money with grins and backslaps, their minds already on the saloons and boarding houses. They were good men, for the most part, and he wished them well. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Elias and Sarah were loading the last of their supplies into a newly purchased buckboard wagon, a sturdy vehicle meant for the journey to his, now their, ranch. Silas had already been paid a generous bonus and was heading south on the morning stage, his retirement finally secure. Jebediah Stone, his pockets full of pay and his belly full of whiskey, swaggered toward them, flanked by two other drovers. His face was flushed, his eyes holding a familiar, malevolent gleam. Well, Jeb sneered, his voice loud enough for the passers-by to hear. Look at the happy couple, buying housewares. Ain't that sweet? Elias straightened up, his body tensing. He placed himself slightly in front of Sarah, a subtle, protective shift. The drive is over, Jeb. Go on your way. Oh, I'm going. Jeb chuckled in nasty, grating sound. But I just wanted to congratulate our little hero. He leered at Sarah, his gaze dropping pointedly to her stomach. Did a fine job leading those cattle. Must have learned some special calls on her back to earn a reward like this. The insult, crude and public, hung in a muddy street. People stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Sarah flinched as if struck, her face draining of color. All the old shame, the humiliation she had fought so hard to overcome, rushed back in a suffocating wave. But then, something hardened in her eyes. The woman who had faced down a blizzard was not going to be broken by a drunken fool. She took a small step forward, out from behind Elias's shadow. She looked Jebediah Stone directly in the eye, her chin held high. I earned my place with work, Mr. Stone, she said, her voice low but carrying with a startling clarity. Something you only seem to do when the boss is watching. Jeb's face purpled with rage. He took a menacing step forward. Why, you little? He never finished the sentence. Elias moved, not with a fist, but with a quiet, implacable finality. He stepped directly into Jeb's path, his body a solid wall. He was not a large man, but he radiated an authority that was absolute. That's enough, Elias said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a razor. He looked not just at Jeb, but at every person watching. His gaze was cold and hard as iron. This woman, he announced, his voice ringing with a conviction that left no room for argument, is Sarah Thorne. She is my wife and my partner. The lie came to him in an instant, a shield forged of necessity and something more, something he was only just beginning to understand. She owns half of everything I have. From this wagon to the ranch, it's taking us to. An insult to her is an insult to me. And if I hear another word against her from anyone, I will take it as a personal matter. He let the words settle. Then, in a gesture that sealed the proclamation, he reached back, his hand finding Sarah's. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and steady. It was a public declaration, an act of possession and protection that was so defiant, so unequivocal, that it stunned the crowd into silence. Jeb stood there, his drunken bravado deflating like a pricked balloon. He had expected a brawl, a shouting match. He was unprepared for this cold, unassailable declaration of honor. He looked at Elias's unyielding face, at Sarah standing beside him, no longer a victim but a partner defended, and he saw that he had lost. Shamed and outmaneuvered, he muttered a curse, turned, and shoved his way through the crowd, his cronies trailing behind him. The onlookers dispersed, their gossip now tinged with a grudging respect. Elias and Sarah were left standing by the wagon, their hands still joined. The air crackled with the enormity of what had just happened. He had named her his wife. He had claimed her and her child, as his own in front of the world. She looked up at him, her stormy eyes filled with 1,000 questions. He met her gaze, and in that shared look, the proposition of a business partnership transformed into the foundation of a life. The transaction was over. The commitment had just begun. He had given her his name as a shield, but he realized, with a startling jolt of clarity, that in doing so, he had saved himself. He had found the one thing his ranch, his money, and his solitary pride could never have given him: a reason. The journey away from Miles City was a quiet one. The buckboard rattled along the rutted track, leaving the chaotic town behind and heading toward the clean, open spaces of the west. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, the air crisp and clean. The world felt new, washed clean by the hardship they had endured. They didn't speak of what had happened with Jeb, nor of the public declaration Elias had made. The words hung in the air between them, a truth too new and fragile to be examined too closely. It was a fact that had been spoken into existence, and for now, that was enough. It had changed the space between them. The distance was gone, replaced by a comfortable, shared silence. Sarah sat on the wagon seat beside him, the rough wool of his coat brushing against her arm. She was no longer the desperate fugitive who had begged for a job, nor the mythical figure who had tamed a blizzard. She was simply Sarah, a woman on her way home. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't running from something, but heading towards something. A sense of peace, so long a stranger, began to settle in her heart. Elias kept his eyes on the road, but his awareness was entirely focused on the woman beside him. He felt her presence as a warmth against the chill of his long solitude. He had spent his life building a fortress of self-reliance, believing that strength meant standing alone. But in defending her, in linking his life to hers, he had discovered a different kind of strength, one that was shared and fortified. It felt more real and lasting than anything he had ever known. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, casting a golden glow over the rolling plains, Sarah began to hum. It was the same low, steady, melodic chant she had used to calm the herd in the heart of the storm. But now it was not a tool of survival. It was a soft, contented sound, a melody of peace. A song for the child sleeping safely beneath her heart, a lullaby for the future. Elias looked over at her. He saw the soft curve of her cheek in the evening light, the way her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, the profound calm in her expression. He looked at her, then at the vast, promising horizon unfolding before them. He had ridden north to save a ranch. He had gambled everything he had on a herd of cattle. But he knew now, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that the greatest prize of the long trail drive was not waiting for him at his destination. She was sitting right here beside him. He hadn't just bought himself a future. He had found his home. I am an AI assistant. I have listened to your story, and I will now provide an outro. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They survived hardship and found a new beginning. What are you hoping for them next? Share in the comments.